Have you ever wanted to take your CNC projects beyond flat surfaces and unlock the next dimension of rotary machining? In this session, I'm going to show you exactly how. I've designed and cut these two custom carving mallets using Vectric software. One was created in VCarve using simple 2D vectors and toolpaths, and the other in Aspire, where I'll show you how to push the limits with full 3D modeling and custom textures. Now I know what some of you lathe turners are probably thinking. You can make a simple mallet just like this in a few minutes on the lathe. And you're absolutely right. But what really sets the CNC rotary apart is what comes next. The ability to add 3D textures, project toolpaths directly onto curved surfaces, and create designs that go way beyond what's possible with traditional turning. Plus, not everyone owns a lathe, and for many of us, the rotary attachment feels like a natural extension of the CNC workflow that we already know. And the best part of these projects is both mallets were carved entirely with a single 1/4" ball nose bit. No tool changes, no complicated setups, just one bit from start to finish. So whether you're brand new to rotary machining or looking for new ways to get creative, I'll walk you through step by step through how to design, toolpath, and cut your own wrapped rotary projects. And of course, I'll share plenty of tips and tricks along the way to make your rotary journey smoother and more fun. So let's jump in and start designing your next rotary project. To start this project, the first thing we need to do is set up a rotary project. This first one I'm going to show you is going to be the VCarve version, which is a little bit more simple. And although I'll be using Aspire in this video, just know that everything I'm going to show you can also be done in VCarve Desktop and VCarve Pro. I personally just use Aspire, so that's what I'm going to be using for this video. So what we're going to do is click Create a New File, and up at the top, you want to make sure you select Rotary for your project type. When you do that, it's going to change the dimensions here for length and diameter. That's the only thing we need for a rotary project. So for this, it's best if you have your material first that you can measure, and you'll measure your blank of material. I don't have the blank on me right now, but I know it's approximate size, and I can always adjust this measurement later before I export my toolpath files. So I'm going to put in some approximate measurements here for now. I'm going to start with 14 inches for the length, and then for the diameter, I am going to do around 2 5/8, and my units are in inches. Now, of course, these measurements can be whatever you want for your particular job, but these are going to be measurements I'm going to start out with. Okay, now we're going to come down here to Z0 position. There is two options, the cylinder surface or the cylinder axis, which is the center of your material. 99% of the time, I always recommend cylinder axis. There are rare occasions you may want to use cylinder surface, but that is a very inaccurate way of zeroing on a cylinder surface. I would always almost recommend the cylinder axis. So that's what I typically will use. And then next we have the XY datum position. Once again, this can be wherever you prefer it. A lot of people like to use the center as the XY datum for zeroing your bits off the center of your cylinder piece. So I would either use center, or sometimes I like to use the lower left corner just because that's something I'm used to. Once again, personal preference on this, I'm going to do the center of the job just to make it easier. That way we can just put a center mark and zero it from there. And then I do not use offsets, so we're going to skip that part. And lastly, we have orientation. This really depends on your machine. Some machines' orientation will be on the x-axis, some will be on the y-axis. That will flip your design when you choose one or the other. So you have to check with your particular machine to see which axis you're going to be designing along. And you'll see along the x-axis that will be going left to right, and along the y-axis will be going top to bottom. I'm going to be designing in the x-axis, so that's what I'll be choosing. And down here for modeling resolution, since this particular project, we're not going to be using a 3D model, this doesn't really matter. So we can leave this at standard, and we're going to click OK. And now we have our job set up, and with Vectric, it will automatically set some things up for you when you set up a rotary project. So one thing you may notice right away is there's blue lines on the sides here. Those blue lines are on a layer by itself called the 2-rail sweep layer. And that is only going to apply for Aspire users. So if you're using vCarve, you probably won't see those rails. And then another automatic layer it adds is bounding box and zero plane. So the zero plane is hidden by default, but if you make it visible, it is just a zero plane. That is something you can use for making cylinder objects. And also there's a bounding box that you can use in some cases as well. Those are just common items used with a Rotary project. So just letting you know they are included when you start up a brand new Rotary project. Okay, and then one of the first things I like to do when starting a new project, something that's good to keep in habit, is to save your project right away. That way it's quicker and easier to save later as you're making your project. That way you don't lose any data. So we are going to rename this project to be Rotary Mallet. And then we're going to click Save. And now that's saved. So now we can quickly click the Save button or Control S on our keyboard, keep things saved throughout the process. And now the first thing we need is a 2D design of our mallet that we're going to be making. So you can use the Create Vector tools to draw your own, but you may want to get some measurements. So if you do a quick search online, you can find many different templates and measurements for different types of mallets. For this particular design, I found this image here. I'm going to right click and I like to just copy the image. You can save the image to your computer and then import it, but I like to just right click, copy on it, and then right click and paste in my project. That way I don't clutter my computer with a lot of downloads of these images because I'm only going to be using this once for this project. So now with this image in place, we can now decide which one we want to trace. In this case, I'm going to do the smaller one. And there are different ways we can trace this. Right now, this is in an image format. We need to make it into a 2D vector format. So the first thing I want to do is rotate this. So I'm going to use the number 0 key on my keyboard. That is a keyboard shortcut to rotate at 45 degrees. And then you click it one more time, and now it's rotated 90 degrees. If this image didn't have the grids and all the detail on here, we may be able to use the trace bitmap feature. And with this feature, you could isolate the image and trace it automatically, but you'll see it gets a lot of extra stuff in here. There are some settings you can adjust to get rid of some of that, but overall, it's not going to give me the nice clean lines that I want for this project. So I'm not going to use this tool. I'm going to click close on that. Instead, what I'm going to use is the draw line tool. There are other tools you can use as well, but for this one, I'm going to use draw line. And with this tool, there are many different ways you can use it. And the main two functions are drawing straight lines and drawing curves. So I'm going to start over here. And the other thing to point out is we only need to draw half of this. So don't worry about one half, just draw the top half in this case. And I'm going to cut it off later to make it perfectly centered. So I'm going to start my first point down here. I'm going to left click to make my first point. I'm going to come up in a straight line until it starts to bend. So right before the bend, I'm going to left click again to make my second point. And now we're starting to get to a bend. So there's a couple ways we can handle this. We can either click the letter S on our keyboard. That will turn it into the draw curve mode, which you can see you can do curves like this. Or if you click backspace, we can undo those. The other method is to go back to the straight line tool by clicking the letter S again. And if we left mouse click and click and hold, you could see that will turn it into a Bezier curve. And this is going to be the method I'm going to use for this one. So I'm just going to move that around until it matches somewhere like the picture shows. Another thing I'm going to do is turn off my smart snapping up in this top corner. This second button here is smart snapping. I'm going to toggle that off. That way it does not try to force me to snap in certain locations. This will give me a little bit more freedom with this tool. So now I'm going to go past this corner. I'm going to click over here and I'm going to hold that in and move it until the curvature matches. And you try to align it with the next curve as well. So you don't want to go too far. You don't want to go up or down. You want to go somewhere along that black line. Something like this. And don't worry about being super precise. We can always adjust the nodes later once we have this design. Now, something like this big long stretch here, you do not have to put a bunch of points in here. We can just put one somewhere in the middle here, left mouse click and move it to try to match what we have on the image. And then I'm going to skip over here some more and left mouse click before we get to this curve. And this one's pretty straight, so I can just left mouse click without holding it in. And now we're getting to a curve here. So I'm going to click past the curve and I'm going to adjust this to try to match. And like I said, we can adjust that later, so don't worry about how precise that is. And now I'm going to come to the bottom of this curve, left mouse click and move that. So as we're going along this, just skip every so often, a left mouse click and adjust. And don't worry if you're not good at this, this will take some practice. So definitely try it out and practice with it. And once you get the hang of it, you'll see how easy it could be. And then this curve here, I'm going to skip up to here. Actually, I can go right to this corner, left mouse click, bend down. And now it starts going straight there. So I'm going to click the letter S on my keyboard again to turn it back to a straight line. I'm going to left mouse click here, and this one I want straight. So I'm going to toggle back on my smart snapping and then come straight here. I can even make a nice square corner, and I can always use the fillet tool to round it over later. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to come down here and make it further past the center line, left mouse click, and then right click to exit. Now that draws the line that we have there. Another tip you can do is change the color of that layer. Let's say we did red. That will make it stand out more against the black background. So that's another tip if you are struggling seeing the line on there. So now that we have the line drawn, we can go back and click on it, click the letter N on your keyboard to go to node editing, and then you can play around with the nodes to try to match it a little bit better if you are off in any places. You can even move the node entirely, and you can get really custom how you want this to look. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I would just get it semi-close to the profile of this shape. So I'm pretty happy with this. I will call this good. The only other thing I'm going to do is round over this corner. So for that, I'm going to be using what's called the fillet tool. So that's in Edit Objects. It's this one here called Fillet. Click on that. This one, you can set the radius. I don't know exactly what radius I want right now. So the nice thing you could do in the newer version is go to the 3D view and you can hover over the corner and see what it looks like before you apply it. So you can see that looks a little large. So I'm going to type in a new number in that box. Let's say 0.08 and click enter. And now that looks more reasonable. We can also make our image visible in the 3D view. So we can hover over that and you can see that matches just about perfectly. So I'm going to click right there and that's going to apply it. And then I can hide the image again to see what that looks like. And that's perfect. That is the new fillet feature in version 12.5. So let's close that down and let's go back to the 2D view. The next thing I want to do is make my center line and trim the extension that we put on those lines. So to do that, we're going to go back to our draw line tool. I'm going to zoom in and draw a line, try to match the center line that's in the image and just try to get it centered there. Make sure your smart snapping's turned on for this so we can make a line nice and straight horizontally across the screen. And for both of these endpoints, I'm going to put past our line. That will make it easier to trim to. So I'm going to left click here at a 0-degree angle and then right click to exit. Now we have a center line going across the center of our project. All right, so now I'm going to hide the image to make this easier for you to see. There is our extensions past the center point. So what I'm going to do now is go to our scissor tool, which is this one here, and I'm going to trim off those bottom pieces. You don't have to trim off the sides, just the bottom, and click close. And now that half is lined up perfectly along the center. And we can make the image visible again, just to see that matching there. All right, so that's our first step. That is our side profile of half of the shape. That's what we need to get started. The next thing we need to do is scale it to the size that we want to cut it. So I'm going to hide the image. We don't really need that anymore. Now we just need to focus on what size do we want to make this. And for that, I would recommend going to the Transform Objects, the Scale tool, which is the second one. Click on that. And here we're going to scale it to whatever size we want to make this. And just keep in mind, this is half of the shape. So whatever this is, it's going to be doubled for the diameter. This is going to be our radius. And right now we are set to be about a 1-inch radius. I want that to be a little bit larger. So what I'm going to do is scale that to 1.25. That will make it 2.5 inches total in diameter. So if you double that number, that's what it would be. Also, you want to make sure your X and Y is linked together, so it will scale the width and height together to keep it proportional. Another thing I'm going to do that is optional is change my anchor position to one of these lower corners. That way it stays on that center line. Now I'm going to click apply, and you see that just got bigger. So now it is 1.25 tall by 9.68 long. So that's going to be the overall measurement. You can unlink this and scale one or the other, but just keep in mind it will stretch or shrink it, and it won't be proportional anymore. So I'm going to keep it like this and click close. The next thing you could do if you'd like is stretch that center line or shrink it depending on how big or small you made your project. We don't really need that center line anymore, but you can keep it there if you like. And we don't really need this on our project anymore. We can move this off to the side if you'd like. And one thing I like to do is center it left to right. That way we get an even gap on the ends. It does not have to be centered, but that just makes it easier in some cases. So I'm going to go to the alignment tool and align it to the material left to right. And actually make sure I don't select the center one. I'm going to select just the object and center that because that will make a difference. And we can make sure both of those are centered independently. Now we can click close. So that takes care of our side profile. Now the only other thing we need for this is a drive rail because we're going to be using the molding toolpath to create this. So if you're not familiar with Rotary, by default, it's going to be considered an unwrapped shape, and you're going to carve it almost as if it's a single-sided project. But the Rotary is going to wrap that up and make it into a cylinder object. So we're going to carve this as if it's a flat object, and then once it wraps as a Rotary, you will see what it looks like as its final form. So what we're going to do is go back to our 2D view, and all we need for this is a simple line. So I'm going to use the draw line tool. I'm going to draw a line from top to bottom or bottom to top, doesn't really matter. It would be the opposite way if you had the project orientated the other way. You could also use the lines that are already here for the 2-rail sweep. That's what they're there for. But like I said, for those of you using VCarve, you probably will not have those. So now we have a line from top to bottom. I'm going to select that line and hold Shift and select our object, which is our side profile. We need to put these lined up together. So for that, I'm going to use the alignment tool, and I'm going to use the align to selection, and we can do the outside left edge. And you'll see that lines up perfectly there on the edge, and click close. All right, so this is the basics of what we need to create this. There are going to be a few more steps, but I'm going to show you what this looks like now that we have this drawn. And a good thing to do at this point is to save our project. So I'm going to click save, and you'll see that keeps everything saved for us. And now if we jump over to the toolpath side, we are going to be using the molding toolpath for this. And that is this one here. This is one of my favorite toolpaths to use because there's so many things you can do with this toolpath. So for this, I'm going to click on it. And to make this work, we need to first select our drive rail, which is this single line here, and then hold Shift and select our side profile. And you'll see by default, it put it on this side. All we have to do, if it goes on the wrong side, just right click and click reverse direction. Now you can see this is where the area will be carving. Another thing is this starting point. We want that to start at our rail, otherwise it's going to flip it around. So if that's on the wrong side, just right click in it and click reverse direction. All right, now that looks good. The next thing we have to do is make our toolpath position for this object. This is basically where do you want to place this object in the thickness of your material. If you remember, we made our project 2 5/8, but our mallet is going to be 2.5. So that means there's an 1/8 inch extra of material. And since this is only considered cutting half of the object, it reduced that in half by a 1/16. So that extra 1/16, I'm going to put that gap at the top. So I can just drag this slider down to the bottom. Now the gap is above. So that means it's going to cut off that extra material at the top, and it's going to leave 0 gap at the bottom. And that's exactly what we want. That will make sure it ends up the exact diameter that we designed it. Now that we have that set up, the next thing you need to do is select a tool. So if you click select, that'll bring up our tool database. For something like this, I recommend using the largest ball nose you can on your machine, or at least the largest one you have available, because this object is not very detailed. It's very smooth, so you can use just a regular ball nose, and it does not have to be a small detailed ball nose because that will take longer to machine. So I'm going to select a 1/4 inch ball nose. And if you want a smoother design, I would recommend around 8 to 12% step over. That will take a little bit longer to machine, but that will give you a nice smooth finish where you don't have to do much sanding. So I'm going to select that. That's going to be our initial tool that does the smoothing portion of the cut. And this cuts in one full depth pass. So if your machine cannot cut that deep in one pass, you're going to need to add a larger area clearance tool. And I do recommend that for this project. So you just check that box on and you select a tool. And you'll notice with this, you can select the exact same tool for the large clearance tool and the regular tool. You can think of this as a roughing pass and a finishing pass. So for this one, we're going to click select and I'm going to choose the exact same tool. The only difference is when I click select, I'm going to click edit on this tool to edit the toolpath setting just for this particular tool. And this will not change it in the database. This will just change it for this toolpath. I'm going to change the step over on this to at least 40%. That's going to cut this much quicker. And we don't need this one to be as smooth because the finishing is going to do it later. Also keep an eye on your pass depth. Do something you're comfortable with this tool. This will use the pass depth for this roughing part. So I'm going to select that. And then we have some more settings here that you can look into. I would recommend adding a ramp. And also this machining allowance, I highly recommend adding that allowance. That leaves a little extra material behind for that finishing tool to clean up later. So I put 0.04 in most cases. So that's what I would recommend here. And we don't have any sharp corners, so we don't have to worry about that. Now let's go down and with everything selected, we're going to click calculate. And you'll see that generated our toolpath. So the first toolpath is the roughing toolpath. And if we preview that, you'll see that will do it in multiple passes and it has a larger step over. Now the second tool you're going to see is going to do one full depth pass and this one's going to be much smoother. So if we preview that second one, you see how smooth that looks. And you may be looking at this and say, this does not look like anything like a mallet. And that's because we have this on wrapped. So in the rotary mode, there's a new button up here for wrapping and unwrapping. If I click that button to wrap it, you'll see, there we go. That's what it looks like as a rotary cut. And that's exactly what we're after for this. Now you can leave it here and be done with it. However, the only thing I would recommend adding to this is cutting over the edge here. That way you don't have to cut this off later after you're done machining. You can either add it into this toolpath. You can add a secondary profile toolpath there as well. Same thing down here. I would recommend adding it into this toolpath, and I'll show you how we can do that. So let's go back to our 2D design, and let's close our preview and go back to the design tab. So to do this, we basically need to add some tabs on the ends. And a simple way to do that is just to draw a rectangle there and weld it together. Or you can draw some shapes, but a rectangle tool works fine for this. And what I like to do is just snap it to this corner and draw whatever I think looks like a good sized tab. Don't have to worry about the width because the width we can change. You don't want to go too wide though, but you want to leave it enough room to where your tool is going to fit in there comfortably. So I'll leave a little extra room there, something like a 1/2 inch should be fine. And then the height you can put wherever looks comfortable. You don't want it too high because you're going to have to cut all that off later, and you don't want it too small because it's going to be very weak. So I would say somewhere in the middle. Something like this should be okay. And I think this will be good here. It's 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch in this case. I think that will look good. And then we're going to do the same thing over here. Now, if I drew that already, I can just switch the anchor point and just click here to draw the same size. But this one, I'm going to shrink down a little bit. So I'm going to close this. And now I'm going to adjust this down to make this tab a little smaller because this end is smaller. And keep in mind, this will double in size. So although this is a 1/2 inch, it's actually going to be 1 inch in diameter. So keep that in mind anytime you're working with rotary. A lot of times you're just drawing half of it and then it's going to double when it wraps. So now that we have this drawn, we need to connect it together to the other design. So a simple way we can do that is with the scissor tool. So if we bring that scissor tool back in, we can cut that here, and same thing here. We're going to cut it there. And if it cuts too much, just edit, undo, and try to get it. Oh, looks like it does not want to cut there. So there's another thing we can do is close this. We can click on this rectangle, click the letter N to go to node edit, and then right click on this line and delete it. And then right click on the bottom one as well. We don't need that either. We can delete the span. While we are in the node edit mode on this side, I'm going to right click on the bottom and delete that span as well. We still have that center line there. Like I said, we don't really need that, but you can leave it there if you like. And then we can use our scissor tool and we should be able to trim that away now. Make sure this box is checked to join everything back together and click close. And now you'll see when we select this, it's all one piece. Now that we adjusted that, we do have to adjust our line that is our drive rail. Otherwise, it's going to shift this all over to that width of the tab that we drawn. So we don't want that. So instead, what I'm going to do is select this drive rail, then hold Shift, select the object, and then click Align Selected Objects. And once again, I'm going to align it to the left outside edge. And now that's going to line it up perfectly. Now that we did that, all we need to do is go back to our toolpaths, double click on the toolpath we already created, and then just reselect our objects. So select the drive rail and then hold Shift, select the side profile. I'm going to right click on this to reverse it again. And everything else should be the same. Just make sure your settings are all back to where they were. And we're going to click Calculate. And I'm going to reset the preview. And now you're going to notice this toolpath has a little extra to it. So when we preview this, now you can see it cut in the tab on both the top and the bottom. That's with the roughing toolpath. And now the finish toolpath is going to come in and cut the rest. And look at that. Now we have a little spot we need to cut off and sand later. So now we can cut that off. And even this one, we could probably make it a little bit smaller, but that's not too bad. And there we go. Now we have a simple rotary design that we can use inside of VCarve Desktop or VCarve Pro, or even Aspire if you have that as well. And then lastly, what we're going to do is make sure we save our project. And then once you are happy with everything, you would export your toolpath and you're ready to cut on your machine. And of course, you can customize this more if you like, but this is the basics that you would need to be able to make this on a rotary. So now that you learned how to do this with toolpaths in VCarve Desktop or VCarve Pro, let's take a look at how to do this with a 3D model inside of Aspire and to be able to customize it even more. So here we are in Aspire. And this one, we're going to create a job the exact same way as before. So we're going to use all the same settings, but the only thing we're going to change this time is the modeling resolution at the bottom. We're going to turn that to very high. And that's because in this one, we're going to actually 3D model the mallet design instead. So once we change that, we're going to click OK. And to save us from redesigning the whole mallet all over again, we can simply go to our previous project that we made, and we can just take that object that we made, right click, copy it, and then go in here and right click and paste it. And there we go. We have that object already ready to go. And for this one, you do not need to make that rectangles on the ends for the tabs. You could add those in as a 3D object, but just to save us time, we already designed that. We can leave it as is. And like I said, Aspire is already going to create these two rails for you at the ends automatically when you start a rotary project. So with those created already, we can just select one, hold Shift, select our object, and then go to the alignment tool, and we're going to align it to the left edge. And then I'm going to deselect those, select the right one, hold Shift, select the object we want to align it to, and choose the right edge. Now we have those lined up perfectly on the edge of that design. And it is important you make them the same width as our design because that'll make it to the exact same size. So now that we have that created, we're going to click Close. And for this next step, we're going to go to the 3D view. And once again, it's a good idea to save our project. So let's save that. And I'm going to save this one as Rotary Mallet Aspire. And now we're ready to create this into a 3D model. And you'll see how easy this is. Right now we have nothing here. Let's unwrap the design to show you it as a flat object. That will make it a little bit easier to understand. So if you select the two rails on the outside, holding shift, and then for this, you're going to be using the 3D modeling tools in Aspire. And for this one, we're going to be using the one called two rail sweep. So you're going to click on that one. And when you select the two rails, you're going to click use selection. And you're not going to see anything in the 3D view, but if you go to the 2D view, you can see they're going to turn into the rails. And then if we go back to the 3D view, we can select the side profile as our cross section, and we can turn all these options off. We don't really need those. We can give it a name. We'll just say mallet and click apply. And when you do that, you'll see it generates a 3D object. And right now it is in the flat on wrap mode. But if we click wrap, you're going to see that wraps it into a circle. And look at that. We have our rotary design already created for us. And the nice thing about this is that it's a 3D object that we can now add things to if you wanted to. Another thing you could do is project toolpaths on top of this 3D model. So that gives you a lot more flexibility as well. So I'm going to show you a couple things we can do to make a nice textured handle. You can also engrave a logo or some text or anything you wanted to on this as well. So let's click close on this. And let's look into adding a nice design into the handle. And now you can see a 3D object is in the 2D view. So we can use that as a reference as well. But I'm going to bring in a guideline to show where we want to put this. I'm going to say, let's go to the center point there. And then I'm going to click in our left ruler again to bring another guideline in. I'm going to put this near the bottom, somewhere around this midpoint of that valley. And let's call that our start and stopping points of the texture. I actually may center this in the valley of this area as well to make it look a little bit more uniform. So now we have those there. This first technique I'm going to show you is using a gadget to make a nice spiral texture. And in order to use this gadget, we need to know the starting and stopping points of these lines in reference to the edge of our project. So for that, I'm going to go to the dimension tool, and I'm going to do a horizontal dimension, and I'm going to go from the left edge to this point here where the guideline is. And you'll notice you cannot really snap to the guideline itself. So sometimes it's easier to draw a line on top of that, because the line you can snap to the guideline. So I'm going to draw a temporary line there and a temporary one here as well. Those are two lines we're going to use as reference points. So now we can go back to the dimension tool and snap from the corner to this line, which we can now snap to, which is be right here. And let's put our dimension there. And I'm going to do another one over here, snap to that line to the end to find our measurements. So there we go. Now we have two measurements to work with. Let's now go to our gadgets. So if you go up to the top and click gadgets, and you're going to go to wrapping. You should have a folder called wrapping. And this is available in VCarve Pro and Aspire. So keep that in mind for those VCarve Pro users out there. Let's go to the spiral layout, and you'll see this will bring up a form that we can enter in some dimensions. So here is going to be the number of strands that you want for the number of spirals that you want. And I was already playing around with this, so I'm going to try 20. And the spacing between strands, that can be up to you as well. You can put whatever spacing you want between those. And then you could do a right hand twist or a left hand twist. And then there's also coves that you can put on the ends. That's basically a line that will be on the ends. And then more importantly is our offset distance here. That's those measurements that we have. So offset from the start is the 7.3 number. So I'm going to type that in here, 7.3. And then I'm going to move this form over. And our end measurement is 2.9. So I'm going to enter that here, 2.9. And that's really all we need for this. Once you're done, you click OK. And it will tell you the number of revolutions for the spirals. Click OK. And you'll see that automatically draws these spiral lines here. They don't look like spirals right now because these do get wrapped around. So they will be spiraled. And another thing that it will draw is lines for the coves. So you may have to hide your guidelines in the toggle up at the top, and you'll see a line on both ends if you added the cove option. So those will be there as well. Now, if we go to our toolpath side and go to our 3D view, you can see right now we have no toolpaths, but we do have the 3D object. Since this is a 3D object, we need to machine this in a different way. This is now going to be machined as a 3D toolpath. So that is going to be a difference between doing it this way and the other way. But the 3D toolpath gives you a lot more flexibility with changing toolpath directions and things like that. So I'm going to start out with the 3D roughing toolpath. And for this, I'm going to do the model boundary as the boundary. I'm going to use the same exact tool as we did before. And this one, we do not need the 8% step over. I'm going to edit this and make sure this is 40%. So keep everything the same. And once again, we're going to add in that machining allowance, 0.04. And here's where I said you have a lot more flexibility. There's different strategies and different raster angles and all kinds of things you cannot change in the molding toolpath. So I'm just going to do a 3D raster for this one. And that's it. We can click calculate, and this will now generate a toolpath to machine this as a roughing. And another thing you're going to notice is now the toolpath is going with the direction of the rotary instead of against it like the molding toolpath does. So that's one thing you have a lot more flexibility over. And you're also going to notice this actually machined all the way to the edge. And that is something I forgot to mention, is it automatically adds a zero plane. Like I mentioned earlier, you have to turn that off when you calculate this toolpath. So I'm going to turn that visibility off, and then I'm going to right click and recalculate this to get rid of that end that it added on there. There we go. You can see that recalculated. Now it's no longer machining all the way to the edge. Now it's only machining to the edge of our 3D tab that we added. So let's preview this. And you'll see that is the roughing toolpath. Looks pretty good. And you can see our tabs in place there as well. That's perfect. Now that is roughed out, we can switch to the finishing toolpath. So we're going to go to 3D finish toolpath. I'm going to use the same tool again. And you can also make sure your step over on this one is smaller. I'm going to do 8%. And once again, we're going to go to the model boundary. And once again, you can adjust the strategy. You have other strategies you can use here, but I'm going to use raster again. And that's really all we need to do. I'm going to click calculate. And now you can see this is one full depth pass doing the finishing. We could also skip over the tab on this. We don't really need to machine the tab again. So if you want to put a vector boundary in, you could make it smaller if you like. That is something you can look into as well. But let's preview this. You can see that's going to cut it nice and smooth. And there is our 3D design with our 3D toolpath. And the next thing we're going to do is add in that spiral. So the reason we didn't do that spiral before is because we didn't have anything machined. But now that we have it machined, now we can project a toolpath onto this 3D model. So what we need to do is select the spiral design that we have here. And that's just these lines that we have on this angle. With those selected, I'm going to be using the profile toolpath. I'm also going to hold shift and select the cove ends as well. That's just the lines on the ends. Those are optional, but I'll show you what those look like. And then for this, you just need to set a cut depth. You can use whatever bit you like for this. It could be a ball nose, could be a V-bit, could even be an end mill. Each one is going to give it a different look and texture. So I would experiment with those and see what you like the most. But the cut depth should be pretty shallow. In this case, I'm going to try 0.05 and see what that looks like. I'm actually going to try the 1/4 inch end mill that we used for the other toolpaths. That way we can use the same bit for this whole project and not have to change it. So let's try that out and see what we can do there. And let's choose the 1/4 inch ball nose and select this. And you want to make sure you're cutting on the line for this one. And that's really all you need to do. I don't really recommend any ramps or anything because you're cutting pretty shallow, but you can add them if you like. Let's click calculate on this. And you'll notice I forgot a big step on this. Right now, the toolpath is thinking it's cutting on the surface of the cylinder object, but we actually want it to cut on the surface of the handle. So in order to change that, we have to open up the toolpath again by double clicking on it and make sure you have show advanced toolpath option selected. And then down at the bottom, there's a button that says project toolpath onto 3D model. Make sure you select that. That's going to be very important for this. And now let's click calculate, and you'll see that adjusts the toolpath to now go on top of the handle, and it will curve with the handle as well. So let's slow this toolpath down so we can see it and click preview, and it will preview it as a flat object first. But as you can see, it's going to cut along that diagonal, and it's going to make all those grooves in there. And you can adjust the spacing, and you can adjust the cut depth and whatever tool you want to use to get different effects. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Just experiment with what you like, and you can even do some test cuts on some scrap material. So let's speed that up, and look at that. That looks pretty cool. So that gives it that nice spiral design. And you can see this is the cove end that we cut. That just cuts a groove at the bottom and the top. And I think that looks pretty cool. Now, of course, if you want to change this, you definitely can. You can change the cut depth if you don't want it that deep. You can change the spacing with the spiral gadget by creating new spirals. But I think that looks pretty cool. Now, you can definitely experiment with that. I just wanted to show you that as an option if you wanted to cut something like that. And if you wanted to cross-hatch this by adding a design in the opposite direction, you can run the gadget again and do an opposite spiral and cut that as well, and that would give you a pretty cool effect. And then with that added design for the handle, that adds another only 3 minutes to the cut time. So that cuts really quick for the handle just because it's a simple profile toolpath, cutting once per each line. So that makes it a really quick way to add some of that texture. And that's something we cannot do in VCarve Desktop or VCarve Pro unless you had this as an imported model. Now with the file pack we'll be providing for this lesson, I will provide an STL file that you can import into VCarve Desktop or VCarve Pro. So if you guys want to experiment with that, you can import the model and then you can project any toolpath you want onto that model. The problem is if you design it from scratch in VCarve, it's not a 3D model, it is just toolpaths and vectors. So that's why it's important to have that imported 3D model inside of VCarve if you want to add extra things like this. But since we have Aspire, you can design it and project toolpaths onto the 3D model all from scratch within the same program. So that's one of the benefits of having Aspire. Now let's look at one more texture technique. And this one's going to be 3D modeling the texture. And this one's going to be a little bit more advanced. So hopefully you can stick with me through this one. And what we're going to do for this is we can actually use the spirals that we made earlier to judge the size that we're going to make this. So by the spacing of these are going to be exactly spaced evenly throughout our rotary project. So I'm going to jump back over to the design tab, and I'm going to use the draw rectangle tool for this. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to draw a rectangle the same height as the spacing here. I could do that by left mouse clicking in this corner and dragging up until it snaps there and then come over. And if I actually hold the control key, it will keep it square. So now it's a perfect square and I can let go of my mouse, and that just drew a rectangle exactly the spacing to make it nice evenly spaced through this project. This part is going to be a little bit tricky to make sure everything works out, but you'll see the technique I use coming up here. The next thing I'm going to do is hide those spiral lines out of our way. Those were placed on their own layer, so I can turn off the spiral vectors and the cove vectors. However, we do need a rectangle around that area, so I'm going to bring back the cove vectors for right now. And on a new layer, I'm going to just put this as box. And I'm going to make this red so we can see it and make sure it's active, and go to the draw rectangle tool. And I'm going to draw a rectangle inside of here, the same size as the area we were using before. And then click close. Now we have that rectangle as our bounding box. Let's take a look at this in the 3D view now. I'm going to unwrap this and I'm going to make our vectors visible so we can see what we're doing. I'm going to select that rectangle that we made, that little tiny one. And I'm going to go to our modeling tools. There's many different tools you can use for this. I'm going to use the angular shape component, which is the third one. I'm going to click on that. And I like to do it by looking at it in the 3D view rather than using the form. So in the 3D view, we can just click this angle button and drag it up to add some angle. And you can see you can move it up and down to see what it looks like. You can see that looks quite large. So I'm going to type in a number here instead. I'm going to type in 10 degrees. Click enter. And you see that looks pretty shallow. And I think that will give it a nice texture if we have a lot of those rectangles like that. So basically change it to whatever you want the texture to look like. You can play around with this as much as you need to. There is no right or wrong number for these. That's all I'm going to adjust is the angle. You can adjust other things if you like, but I'm just going to change the angle and give this a name. I'm going to call it texture and click close. Now we have a brand new component called texture, and that is that shape there. Now I want this to be over the entire surface of this handle, and you could just copy and paste this a bunch of times, or you can use the array copy tool, but that's going to make hundreds of these rectangles. And if you have to move anything later, you're going to have to move them all together, and it's really hard to get those to work out properly. So Aspire actually has a nice handy tool for this, and that is called the Texture Area Component tool. So if you click on that tool inside of the modeling tools, there is this tool that you need to select the rectangle and hold shift and select the object. You need to select both of those. If you don't select that rectangle that we drew, it's going to create these over the entire shape of our project, but I want to keep it within this rectangle. That's why we drew that. So now with both of those selected, if I just click apply without changing anything, and you can see it did something, but you can't see it, and that's because the combine mode is set to merge. We want to switch this to add on top of the surface. And look at that. We have some nice texture on there, and it automatically created all of that just with a click of a button. Another thing you could do is put it in the wrap mode to see what this looks like. And you can see that looks really cool. Now there is alignment issues we have there at the seam. So like I said, there is some adjustments you're going to have to make. You may have to adjust the measurements a little bit to make sure that works out. But other than that, it looks really good. And almost looks like a hand grenade, maybe you would think of this as, or maybe like a textured vase. So that's something you can play around with. So to adjust the seam where they line up, like I said, sometimes that may not line up perfectly. So what we can do there is adjust this in the 2D view. It's a little bit easier to see. So if you double click on it in the 2D view and extend where it got cut off, we can move that and try to bring it right here where it's in between two of the rectangles. And when we move this, it actually adds more to the design. That's one thing about the texture area component tool is it doesn't actually scale the object. It actually adds more to the texture. So that's something cool. If you wanted to add more texture up the length of this, you can just stretch it and add the texture all the way up. So it's a really cool feature about that. So let me undo that and go back to our 2D view and undo that again. And that looks better there. So if you're stretching this and only adding more to it, you may be wondering, how do I make this smaller by scaling it? So you have to actually bake that to do it. Before I bake it though, I'm also going to adjust this bottom here as well. You'll see that gets cut off in the middle of the peak, which I think looks better if it cuts off at the valley. So what we'll do is extend this bottom as well. So I'm going to double click on this and stretch it until we get to the valley there. And you can see this in the 2D view by the dark area about there. Looks really good. Now I can see the 3D view. That looks much better. You can also add a little accent piece there to cover up any gaps there, but I think this looks okay. Now that we have that created and stretched up here, what we need to do is bake this. So what we're going to do is right click on this new component and click bake. That has now been baked. Now if we stretch this, it's actually going to scale it. You'll see it shrinks it up and down. Keep in mind that we'll make some adjustments to the height. So don't go too crazy with this, but I'm going to bring it down and try to put it right on the edge there. Get as close as you can. It's okay if you have a little overlap, just make sure there's no gap there. And you'll see if we go to the 3D view and wrap this again and take a look at our seam, that looks much better. So that's what we're going to go with. And then we did extend it down here at the bottom some more. So if you want to select this, let me go on the unwrap view and double click on this. You could use your arrow keys left and right. I'm going to go left and move it up the handle some more. Try to center that a little bit better. And we can wrap it again and see what that looks like. I think that looks pretty good. So once we have some texture like that, this is 3D. So we do not have to make a whole new toolpath for that. We can incorporate it with the toolpath we already have. And if you do something really detailed, you may need a smaller bit. But since we already have a 1/4 inch bit, let's try to see what that looks like and see if we need to make something new. So we're going to switch over to our toolpath tab. We do not need that profile toolpath that we made earlier. I'm going to skip that one. So I'm going to check box both of the 3D finishing and roughing toolpaths. Right click on those, go to recalculate and click recalculate visible toolpaths. And when you do that, that will now recalculate them with the new texture added. So that's really cool. As long as the texture is visible, it will calculate for the 3D toolpaths. All right, when we're done, click OK. Let's go to the preview, reset the preview. Let's preview the roughing toolpath first. And you'll see there's the texture. You can start to see it there. And now let's look at the 3D finish toolpath and preview that. And look at that. That looks pretty good. I think that's going to be good enough. Like I said, you could use a smaller bit if you wanted to get more of that detail. But I think that looks pretty good. And then a little light sanding on this should be good. You can even adjust your step over if you wanted to. But look at that. That looks pretty cool. So there you have it. That's a quick and easy way to add some custom texture. Or if you want a more simple design, you can go the molding toolpath way. But hopefully some of those tips helped you get some inspiration on where you can go with this. And before we save these toolpaths and take them to our machine, one last thing to consider is we are starting out with a square blank of material. And when you're working in Vectric and on a rotary project, it is assuming you're starting out with a cylinder piece of material, something like a dowel. And if you're not starting with that, you could have issues where the bit will crash into the corners of the square blank. So there is a handy feature in the gadgets area. You can go down to wrapping and then click create rounding toolpath. In here, you can use either a square blank or a round blank, and this will create a rounding toolpath to make your object a cylinder. This is a great first step to knock down those corners and prepare it for rotary machining. You could skip this step. Another thing I like to do is either take a bandsaw or a table saw and cut those corners off and make the material more of an octagon shape. Also, if you have a lathe, you can also turn your square blank into a round blank a lot easier. But this is a quick and easy way to make the toolpath to have the machine do it for you. So in here, all we need to do is type in the square size of our blank. So in this case, mine is 2 5/8. And then you would select your machining method. In my case, I'm going to use the optimize raster. So that will machine the corners first and then machine it to be a round cylindrical object. You could add an allowance if you like, but in this case, I do not need that. And then the last thing we need to do is select a tool. So I'm going to click select. And once again, we're going to be using the same tool we have been using for this entire project, and that will be the 1/4 inch ball nose. And then in here, you can adjust the settings if you like. I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive with the step over. So I'll do 60%, a pass depth of 1/8 of an inch. And then your feed and plunge rates you can set to whatever you like. And then we're going to select that. And then we're going to click select. And now it will tell you what the cylinder size will end up being. And then click OK. And you will now see this toolpath is going to machine away the 4 corners and turn our project to be a round cylinder. Now keep in mind, you won't be able to preview this in the 3D view because, like I said, Vectric is already assuming you're starting out with a round cylinder object, but you can see the 4 corners being machined in this example. And one thing I would highly recommend doing is taking that rounding toolpath and moving it up to the top. That will machine first, and then our roughing, and then our finishing. And then that profile that we did projecting the toolpath, that is optional if you want that or not. In this case, we are just going to run the first 3 toolpaths doing our textured handle. And that rounding toolpath will be the same for VCarve Pro and Aspire. For those of you that use VCarve Desktop, unfortunately, you will not have access to the gadgets, but there are workarounds for creating a rounding toolpath, such as a pocket toolpath. So that's something you can explore with VCarve Desktop. So I'm going to use the same exact rounding toolpath for both mallets, the VCarve and Aspire version. And now that we have everything created, we're going to export our toolpaths and take them to our CNC and they're all going to be one file because we're using the same tool. So you do not need to save them as multiple toolpaths. So in the software to do that, you will just go to Save Toolpaths in your toolpath menu, and then make sure you have visible toolpaths to one file, and then select all of your toolpaths. And make sure they're all the same tool number and the same bit. That way they all get saved together as one single file. And then just make sure you select the correct post-processor. This should be a Rotary post-processor. And if you don't see it, you can find it in the list of different post-processors. So I'm going to select the one that I'll be using, which in my case, I will be wrapping the Y axis. So mine will be wrap Y. And then we're going to click Save Toolpath, take it out to our machine, and start running the file. So let's go see how these get cut out. I hope this session helped you see what's possible with wrapped rotary machining. If you have any questions or you want to learn more about my Vectric training programs, you can find me over at learnyourcnc.com. Thanks for watching and happy machining.